So no one has seen God at any time. The only begotten Son, who is in the bosom of the Father, he has declared him. So when you close your eyes and you imagine God, what do you see? How would you describe him?
I wouldn't dare begin.
You wouldn't dare begin that? Is that what you said?
Yes.
Okay. That's too scary to think about. What
Yes.
about? I'm sorry?
I see somebody I see a throne, in the sea of glass. And I see, it's almost like I can't see him. It's just light. I see almost on a throne.
Wow. Interesting. Yeah. So you see light, you see a throne. How very cool is that? What else? How do y'all see God? No one's ever thought about this?
I don't get much beyond the robe. Because it's like if you think of the biggest area that you can think of, and then think of, his robe trailing off,
mm-hmm.
And yes, there's light, but I mean, just the hugeness, the extraordinary size, the sense of, he is far greater is the sense that I get out of that.
Yeah. Oh yeah. The greatness. Oh wow. That's really cool. Good stuff. What else? Anybody else?
I see him as a grandfather kind of a figure. He's very loving. He's very kind. He's white hair and a long white beard, and he loves me.
I love that. So you see this kind of grandfatherly, older gentleman, who's love and gentle, and okay, cool. Tony, were you going to add something to that, or were you just agreeing?
I just agreeing.
Cool. Anybody else? How do y'all see God?
I see him as a father, and I see him as not necessarily. Well, I know he sits on the throne, but when I close my eyes, I'm able to sit at his feet and be comfortable and be peaceful, and him holding me and telling me he loves me, or just communicating with my daddy. That's what I see.
I love that. I love these images. Isn't it interesting how to kind of hear how we kind of look at God? Anybody else? I don't want to cut anybody short if you're about to say something.
I remember that, and I don't know where it's located, that he can hold the sea in his hand. And in order to do that, someone has to be great. He has to be huge.
Yeah.
I never did have a real father most of my life. My dad died when I was young.
Mm-hmm.
And so I look at God as being someone that I can go to, and he can put his arms around me and show me love.
Wow, I love that. That's really cool. And what's really cool is that no matter what your relationship is with your parents or your dad, we have this loving heavenly Father. We have the ultimate Father. So I love that. The other thing Dennis said was there's this greatness, this kind of almost incomprehensible greatness of God. You imagine holding the seas if you go to Galveston, or if you go to the West Coast and see the Pacific Ocean, this idea of that being held in the hands of God. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. If you take it a next step, the universe and the solar system is all in his hands. It's really unimaginable. I think about it. Good stuff, guys. Thanks. So we're going to be talking about John 1 today. Hold on one second. Sorry, guys. I lost y'all again. Y'all are back. So we're talking about this. We've been going through this series called This Is One Story, God Became Flesh. And today we're going to be talking about John 1, and we're going to have some various passages from John 1. These are pretty popular. You've probably read these. But there's kind of 3 points that I really want to kind of spend our time on. Number one is, does John 1 change the view or change our view of God? So, do we see God differently because of John 1? Clearly, based on some of the answers that we just got when we were talking, I would have to say yes. We're going to talk about that a little bit. Number two, why did God make man? Why did God make mankind? We're going to talk about that for a split second. And then third, is God safe, or is God's glory safe? Is his presence safe? So those are the kind of 3 things. Does John 1 change the view of God? Number 2 is, why did God make man? And 3, is God's glory or God's presence safe? So let's read the passage. John 1 through 5. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So you guys are familiar with this passage. I'm assuming probably most of you have heard this. Verse 2, he was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. So who are we talking about? Who is the Word here?
Jesus.
Jesus, very good. By the way, if I ever ask you a question and you're not sure, just throw out Jesus and you're 50% chance right. So this is pretty astonishing. In the beginning was the Word. So in the beginning was Jesus. Jesus was not created. Jesus wasn't made. Jesus was eternal. This is when we read these verses, this is kind of a private behind the scenes look at God. So before time, there was we're going to read there was this interpersonal relationship. So before the world began, this is what God looks like. As you know, I quote and read Tim Keller. I use him as a source quite a bit when I'm putting these things together. And Tim Keller describes these passages as John is giving us a different vantage point. Keller is kind of describing these passages as like someone who's lived their whole life, and he's talking about the Jewish people, someone who's lived their whole life at the bottom of a mountain. And then one day, after 30 or 40 or 50 years, they go to the top of the mountain, and now everything looks different. So what in the world is God? What is Keller talking about? How do the Jewish people see God? How do they see him? How did other religions see God at this time, or now even?
Terrifying.
Yeah.
Terrifying. Okay. What else?
Someone to be appeased.
Someone to be appeased. That's right. Yeah.
Judge, someone who judges.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, someone who judges, someone who is, capricious. I don't know. Someone who is, vindictive, perhaps even. I don't know.
Mhm.
Anybody want to
Well-
add to that? How did the Jewish people, how would John, who was a good Jewish man, probably follow Levitical law, how would he have seen God? What was his view? What would his view have looked like?
It would not look like the Trinity.
Definitely not look like the Trinity. Very good. Yeah.
Well, in the New Testament, we see him as a God of love.
Yeah.
And since the Jew is still looking toward the Old Testament, they're seeing God as someone who has kind of like a stick over their head, and they have to obey everything that he says, or judgment will come on them.
Yeah.
And they don't picture him as a God of love like we do, I don't believe.
Yeah, I would agree with that. When we started this lesson and I asked, how did you picture God? And would we all agree that a general consensus was tea and fatherly love and gentleness and I mean, was that kind of would that be a good way to kind of describe what everybody was saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. Is that how the Jewish people then, and even to some degree now, is that how the Jewish people see God?
No,
Absolutely not. Yeah, they see.
Interestingly, sorry to interrupt, but one of the things I couldn't help thinking of how many instances you had these Christophanies in the Old Testament and God appearing, and the immediate reaction was, "Oh no, I've seen God. I'm doomed." And God telling them, "No, don't worry. You're gonna live." Like Gideon's parents and people like, "Oh no, we've been visited by God," and God being called, not just the God of Israel, but the terror of Israel. I mean, that's a powerful word, God being described as the terror of Israel. So, yeah, but I just thought of all those instances of God appearing and people saying, "Oh, I'm undone." Even Isaiah, when he has that wonderful vision, it's like, I'm undone. I'm a dead guy. I've seen God. I've gotten a glimpse of him. I'm doomed.
Yeah. And we're gonna talk a little bit more about that as we kind of read some more passages in First John. But it is interesting. We see God differently. So I think what Keller is suggesting here, and what John is suggesting here, is that when we read Jesus, what are we seeing? We're seeing a new vantage. We see God differently. And so before Jesus, we see an incomplete picture. Before Jesus, we see a God of love. Jesus shows us a God of, before Jesus, people see God as a God of law. Jesus is showing us a God of law and mercy. People saw this arbitrary or capricious God or gods. Jesus is showing us a God with a purpose and design. And this passage is also kind of showing us, and as we read this, some loving communication and coordinated creativity. Notice that phrase, the Word or the Son was with God. The word here means there's closeness. There's like perfect closeness. And I want to skip down to verse 18 and kind of examine that a little bit. So in 1 John verse 18, no one has seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God, is in the closest relationship with the Father, has made him known. So that's the NIV. The New King James, I think, gets it a little bit closer. No one has seen God at any time. The only begotten Son, who is in the bosom of the Father, who has declared him. So in the literal translation is probably the Son is on the bosom or on the breast of God. So God and Jesus are in this kind of, they're in spiritual form, but not physical form. But what's this picture? What is kind of John trying to say about Jesus and God? What does their relationship look like?
They're tight.
show them as a father and a son.
They're tight. What did you say, Don? I'm sorry.
Shows it as a father and a son.
Yeah, there's a father and a son. So yeah, absolutely. But it's not just a father and a son, but there's a closeness. When I read something like, their relationship is like on the relationship was like your head on the bosom or your head on the chest. I mean, think about that for a second. In your life, how many people on this planet has the right, if you're laying on the floor, laying on your bed, or laying on a rug, how many people on this planet or in your life have the right to come and just lay their head on your chest or lay your head on your breast?
You froze.
I'm sorry?
You froze for an extended period.
Uh-oh. Can y'all hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So where I don't know where I lost y'all. So where did I leave off?
How many people in your life do you, I guess, lay on your bosom, I guess was where you were going with that?
Think about this closeness when he describes that God and the Son close, like on the bosom of God. I think there's a picture that's being painted here by John, and I want you to kind of imagine how many people in your life could actually do that with you. How many people could actually lay their head has the right to lay their head on your chest or your breast or your bosom? That's this picture that John's kind of painting here. John is describing this relationship. Was someone going to say something? I'm sorry.
I said John actually did that. He actually laid it in Jesus' lap.
Yeah. There's really kind of a cool, really neat relationship that we see here, and this would have been completely foreign to the Jewish people at this time.
It's kind of like your family. We normally say that maybe like the son, we say he looks maybe just like his dad, and he has some of the same characteristics as his dad.
Yeah.
And that's the way it is with the father and the son. But instead of being like that, it's like if you see one, you see the other. It's much closer.
Yeah, that's exactly right. There's a closeness there, and that closeness is like nothing we've ever experienced. I mean, even if you have a wonderful marriage and you and your spouse, there's this closeness, there's this primacy in this description. So John is saying that there's this spiritual oneness, there's this perfect closeness. There is also suggesting that there's joy. In John 17:5, it says, "And now, Father, glorify me in the presence with your glory that I had with you when the world began." So there's joy, there's glory together. John 1 verse 3, "Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made." Was John thinking of this one Proverbs 8, when he wrote this? I'm going to read this to you guys. Proverbs 8, 27 through 31. Wonderful Proverbs. I would highly recommend you guys go read the whole thing. First, but I'm going to just read 27 through 31. "I was there when he set the heavens in place, when he marked out the horizon on the face of the deep. When he established the clouds above and fixed securely the fountains of the deep, when he gave the sea its boundary so the waters would not overstep its command, and when he marked out the foundations of the earth, then I was constantly at his side. I was filled with delight day after day, rejoicing always in his presence, rejoicing in his whole world and delighting in mankind." So how is God, reading this, how is God and the Son in the beginning?
We were as one.
They were as one, that's right. But how would you describe that relationship?
Joyous. They
Joyous. I'm sorry?
rejoice in each other all the time.
Yep. Joyous, rejoicing, delight. There's love here. There's joy here. So how was God in the beginning? Put these ideas together. God is with the Son. There's delight day after day. There is joy together. There's perfect union. You're seeing something really, really kind of beautiful here. There's a joy and closeness more than anyone's ever known. And there's joy there and there's love there. And then when we say back in Genesis, they say, let's make man in our image. They decided to make people to step into this joy and love and wisdom. They created mankind to join God and the Father in this perfect circle of love. Why? Have you ever, and I just want you to think about this for a second. Why did they create mankind? So they're in this joyous, there's this joy, there's this delight. And why did they create mankind? If you've ever seen the analogy I was kind of thinking of, if you've ever seen a wonderful movie or a song, or you've read a book, or maybe you've learned something new in the Bible, what do you do? What do you do in your excitement and your joy?
Share it.
You share it. You want to tell somebody. I remember when Stephanie bought her first new car. I'd be shocked if y'all didn't do the same thing. When you buy your first new car, or you buy your home, what is the thing you do? Stephanie went out, and when she bought her new car, what did she do? She wanted to let her take it and show it to her dad. And then she would say, Dad, drive it around the block. She wanted him to share in that joy with her. She wanted someone to share in that joy. That's what the Father is doing. They're sharing so why did they create us? Verse 30 and 31. I was filled with delight day after day, rejoicing always in the presence, rejoicing in this whole world, and delighting in mankind. Why are they making us? Why did they make us?
Companionship.
Companionship. They're making us for companionship, but they're making us for a purpose. They're bringing us into that joy. What is the meaning of life? Why did God create us? I think it's right there in verse 31.
Worship.
The meaning of his life is that God created us to share in that joy and the delight and the wisdom of God and the Son. So when we read these passages, remember, what is our theme been throughout all this? We've been reading these big, important passages and putting it into the context of a bigger story. Is the Bible one big story with four parts: the creation, fall, redemption, and new creation?
Mm-hmm.
John starts us with creation. Why is God creating us? To participate in his Son's perfect union and joy and wisdom. Let's keep reading John 1 a little bit longer. I'll go back to verses 4 and 5. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. So John is switching the metaphor. John is now describing Jesus as the light of all mankind. Jesus created us. Jesus was God's instrument to create, and through him, God created us. He gave us life. Our life comes from him. I'm going to skip down to verse 9. The true light, which is Jesus, that gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. So Jesus is coming into the world. Why? Verse 10. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to be the children of God. God and the Son, Jesus, they created mankind to participate in the joy. They created us to participate in the delight, but we didn't see them. We were outside the joy. We were outside the delight. Does anybody remember in the Garden of Eden there were two trees? Does anybody remember what were those two trees?
Tree of knowledge.
I'm sorry, say again.
The tree of life.
Tree of life. Okay, that's one of them. What was the other one? Anybody remember?
Tree of knowledge of good and evil.
Tree of knowledge of good and evil. Very good. If y'all remember back when we studied that a few months ago, Charles Spurgeon suggested that the tree of life represented Jesus or God. The tree of knowledge of good and evil. What did Satan tell Eve when she took the fruit?
It's okay. It won't hurt you.
It's okay. I won't hurt you. But he said something to her specific. He made a promise. He said something to her.
Die.
She would not die.
You'll be like God.
You would be like God. Very good. Did y'all? Yeah. There were two choices. God is really making this really simple. There are two choices. There's life, there's God, or there's you, yourself, making yourself like God. That's the choice that started at the very beginning. And when we walked away from the tree of life, when we walked away from life, we walked away from God's joy and his delight. We said we'll do our own thing. I'm going to come back to verse 12 in just a second. I want to go down to verse 14. John 1, verse 14. The Word became flesh. Very famous passage here. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. So we'll go back to our very first metaphor. Who is the Word again?
Jesus.
Jesus, very good. So in verse 14, he says, we have seen this glory. The King James actually says, we beheld his glory. This idea of seeing God's glory or seeing his glory would have been very foreign to John. Any Jewish person reading this would have been really kind of shocked or disturbed by this. Earlier, I asked you, when you think of the presence of God, we had this very positive, this very very positive, warm father-son kind of approach to to God, because we see Jesus. But if you saw God as the Jews saw him, beheld his glory means something very different. To the Jewish people, God's presence is the most potent and powerful thing. Back in Exodus 19 and 20, when we see his presence on Mount Sinai, he says, don't get too close. My presence is on the mountain. If you get too close or you touch the mountain, my glory may break through. It might kill you. And then later in chapter 33, God tells Moses to hide. Moses wants to see God. And so God says, hide in the cliff of the rock, and then I will cover you with my hand and protect you, Moses, from my glory. God's glory is dangerous. God's glory is hazardous to your health. It's not safe. I'm going to go back to Tim Keller for just a second. Tim Keller uses an analogy. He actually uses it a lot. It's the idea of God, and he compares it to the solar system. What makes a system, or what makes a solar system? It's because all the planets orbit a center, the sun. If they didn't orbit a single point, but they just did their own thing, they would bump into each other and destroy each other. So the planets, if they weren't circling a single point, they would actually destroy each other. And the analogy that he uses, or the metaphor he's using, is God is the center of all things. God's glory is the center. He's the solar. All things turn on his glory and his goodness. Everything he does is right and good. The only reason he does anything is because it's right, it's true, it's holy. So if you look at yourself, if you really genuinely take a step back, I look at myself. What do my decisions turn upon? Does my life orbit around truth or holiness? If it doesn't always orbit around goodness or righteousness, if our lives don't orbit around God's glory or holiness, eventually we're going to either bump into him, or we're going to bump into each other and destroy each other and ourselves. So for most of us, our orbit is centering around our happiness. Is happiness ultimately safe? God's glory is not tea and teddy bears. It's dangerous. It's potent. When God and man get together, there's cataclysm. When God and man get together, there's tension. We want fulfillment. We want happiness. We want to be our own king. We want to be our own God. But when there's 7 billion kings, there's disaster and tragedy and death. But John is telling us that we can behold God's glory. The thing that was withheld from Moses, we can now have. How can we have that fire and that power that engulfed the mountain? We can now see and understand and know. Now we can be in that love, intimacy relationship with God and the Son, just like they did before time, and delight with them. I mean, how is that possible? And not
Only through God's grace.
say that again, Don, real quick.
Only through God's grace.
Only through God's grace. And how did God, John gives us that explanation, and it's right here. The Word, Jesus Christ, became flesh. He became man. God became one of us. That's how he redeemed us. We went our own way. And the wages of sin and death, we made the orbit of our lives our happiness and pleasure. But the wages or the payment of those decisions is death. We bump into God. And so God made himself man, and he took a cross and he died so we could be restored. And then back to John 1:12. Yet all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. God delighted in creating us. He and his son delighted in making us. They wanted to share their joy with us, but we ran away. Adam went and ran and hid behind bushes and behind leaves. So God made himself man, and he died on his cross and redeemed and restored us all to joy. In John 1, John is painting a picture of the story of the Bible, that there's God, there was creation. Why did he create us? There was joy, there was love, there was glory, but we butt up against him. We decided to go our own way. And so God, to redeem us, became man. Again, this is our first passage in John. We're going to be spending a lot of weeks talking about John and really kind of diving in and seeing how John and how Jesus fits into this one story, this creation, fall, redemption, new creation. That's what we're going to be spending the next about 2 months on.